Good morning, everyone. I'm Lisa Carenti. I think we're just going to wait a couple minutes here while we give people a chance to come on.
Here we have a few participants showing up.
Good morning, everyone. I think I'm going to go ahead and start. I see a lot of people joining us. Really don't want to wait. We have such an important discussion. I really want to use all our time. So again, I'm Lisa Carenti. I'm CFAM's Executive Vice President, and we're here today hosting this webinar, Dismantling the Pornography Industry and Making the Internet Safe for Children. We have some really wonderful expert guests from the National Center on Sexual Exploitation, also known as NCOSE. First, I'd like to introduce Eleanor Kenley Gayton. She's the Vice President and Director of Public Policy. Eleanor has worked in the field of human trafficking since 2000, when she was a program manager for the U.S. Agency for International Development in Romania. There she met young women arrested abroad and repatriated to Romania, who were all sex trafficking victims. Eleanor was invited to join the State Department's office to monitor and combat trafficking in persons, also known as JTIP. She served as chief editor for 5 trafficking in person reports from 2003 to 2009, while managing NGO relations and legislative affairs. Eleanor joined the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women from 2010 to 2019, where she helped pass major anti-trafficking legislation, including FOSTA-SESTA, which we'll be speaking to a little bit more in the program. Presently, Eleanor leads public policy at both federal and state levels for NCOSE. We're also joined by her colleague, Pansy Watson, who is on NCOSE's legal team, where she litigates against online exploitation. Pansy has a bachelor's degree in philosophy from the University of Texas and a law degree from Gonzaga University. And I just have to interject Go Zags as a big basketball fan. She is a licensed attorney focused on bringing justice to victims of exploitation and changing public policy to create a world free of abuse and objectification. We're also joined by my colleague, Stefano Generini. Stefano is the Vice President for Legal Studies at CFAM. NCOSE is based in Washington, D.C. The center seeks to end all sexual harm and exploitation against women and children. They have a unique, holistic approach, recognizing that issues such as pornography, prostitution, and trafficking are interconnected and overlap. NCOSE is currently engaged in moving a really important piece of legislation called Earn It. It will help to protect children from online sexual exploitation by holding tech companies accountable. We've all heard accounts, terrible accounts of young girls who've been significantly harmed from their private videos being shared on porn sites, and the difficulty that they have in having them permanently removed. So Eleanor, why don't we go to you first, if you can just give us more background on Earn It and why it's so necessary.
Certainly. Thank you so much for that generous introduction, Lisa, though it makes me feel very old. The Earn It Act just passed a fascinating hurdle, and that is the Senate Judiciary Committee voted unanimously to approve it and move it forward for future consideration on the Senate floor. What does it do? It clarifies congressional intent that child sexual abuse material, also known as child pornography, should not be rampant on the internet, which it is today. There was an important New York Times investigation in fall of 2019. It found what they called an almost unfathomable increase in this content, criminal content. Some numbers, we have to use some numbers here, but 2008, there were 600,000 images, files of child pornography on the internet. In 2018, it was up to 70 million. Last year in 2021, over 84.9 million CSAM suspected images or on digital platforms. We're not talking about the deep web. 97% of this material is on the surface web. It is accessible through Reddit, accessible through Twitter, accessible through, you name it, YouTube. And guess who's finding it? Our kids. So one of NCOSE's absolute priorities is to find legal and constitutional ways to limit child access to hardcore pornography, which damages their brain. Earn It Act does, it changes the incentive structure. So technology companies will no longer be indifferent to this very harmful content that is rampant on these platforms. The Communications Decency Act of 1996 was passed by Congress when the internet was a baby. And the idea was you can't hold the highway responsible for drunken drivers in driving cars, right? That makes no sense. So the internet was not going to be held accountable for content because the internet was called not a publisher. However, it is very technologically quite simple, we are told by software engineers and big tech leaders, that to detect this material and delete it. Just as if I complain to YouTube that a copyrighted song of mine that you've posted, a copyrighted song of mine, it's taken down right then. There isn't even an investigation. If I claim copyrights, it's taken down. And yet child sexual abuse material, deeply harmful to those victims, a kind of harm that repeats as it is transmitted infinitely around the world. They refuse. Most of the companies, digital companies like Amazon won't look for it. Dropbox, they won't look for it because they're protected by the CDA 230. Judges have said CDA 230 gives them immunity from any responsibility for that material. Earn It Act just changes that up. It gives tech companies incentives to look, detect, scan, and delete that illegal material because they can be held liable. It removes their blanket liability. That's the main thing it does. It also creates a new commission to look at online exploitation, including the grooming of children online. It provides some new tools to the National Center on Missing and Exploited Children, NCMEC, which is our kind of flagship American entity, sort of a public-private partnership that is supposed to be the repository of these images. And NCMEC is a big supporter of this bill, as are hundreds of organizations from every state. Unfortunately, tech companies are really fighting the Earn It Act hard.
So let's just back up a little bit because I know Pornhub sees 3.5 billion visitors a month. Is that correct? But yet I think most of us still don't understand what is really Pornhub. Now, Pornhub is people sharing their videos. Is that correct? I mean, they're not paying for them. They're putting them up on the site and then people are downloading or sharing them. So explain why it's so difficult for people to have these removed.
So I'm going to ask Pansy to address that because NCOSE is suing Pornhub. And we've had some recent successes in our suit, a class action suit against Pornhub. Pansy?
Yeah, so the way Pornhub works is very similar to the way YouTube works in that a user of their product, which is the website itself, can upload their own videos to that website and actually work with that website to market their videos. So very similar to how like YouTube works. And because they are third parties publishing their content on that website, Pornhub itself then can turn around and claim that CDA immunity that Eleanor was just talking about, because they can say, well, these are third-party publishers. We did not create.
Could you just
content.
break that down, the CDA immunity a little bit?
Yeah.
I think a lot of people are just not familiar with that.
It's kind of a dense topic and it's kind of complicated. So Section 230 was developed at the same time that the internet was rising up. And basically the reasoning behind Section 230 was that websites are not directly liable for content that third parties post on them. So analogy that I like to use is, say I own a public bulletin board in a park. And somebody comes along and posts flyers that are vulgar. I am not liable for those flyers at least not until I know that they're there and I continue to allow them to be there, or unless I am working with that person to post them. So I didn't create that content. I just created the forum in which that person could come and post that content. And so because I did not create that content, I'm not liable for it. So that's really the reasoning behind Section 230. And at the time, this was 1996, we barely had an internet. So one of the motivations was, this is a new market. We don't want to heavily regulate it so that this market can grow. And of course, this market has done far more than grow. It's exploded. Now, Congress made it clear at the time that these laws were developed, and CDA stands for Communications Decency Act. So there were notions already that we already understood that third parties were going to be using this to post anything they wanted to post. So there were already congressional hearings that indicated that Congress's intent was not to give a blank slate to these websites to just let anybody post anything they wanted, but to understand that they couldn't be held completely liable for it, that as long as they were showing some kind of good faith moderation. So like I said, if somebody called me as the owner of the park bulletin board and said, hey, somebody's posting gross things on your bulletin board, and I went and did something about it, then I would not be liable. This was sort of the thinking behind 230. If these websites showed good faith, good sense moderation, and tried to handle what they could handle, then they would be shielded from liability. The problem isn't the law per se. The problem is how the courts ended up interpreting it in multiple cases. So in multiple cases, the courts interpreted the law very, very broadly. And they just kind of said, yeah, this is third-party publishing. Regardless of how it was moderated, the website is shielded from liability. This, in turn, led to an explosion of all kinds of content being posted online with very little incentive for the companies to do much about it. So the law says you need to moderate this in good faith, but in practice, they just moderate it however it's convenient for them to moderate it, because courts have not held them accountable in any kind of consistent fashion. So that's where we're at today. And so when we talk about the Earn It Act being a clarification of congressional intent, what we're saying is that, hey, this wasn't a blank slate to let child pornography be posted on your websites without you doing anything about it. And there are already laws in place that require that you report this to NCMEC and the cyber tip line. And so if you want this immunity, you need to practice this good faith moderation that we asked you to practice in the first place. So that's sort of the thinking behind that. And, our law center is involved in a couple of cases regarding Pornhub, which has all this third-party publishing, and other sites as well, which I can talk about separately, where they're not only not properly screening the videos that are being uploaded to see if anybody in the video looks like they are unconscious or being forced or coerced into what's going on, which is often the case, but they're not even necessarily verifying the ages and identifications of those involved. And in addition to that, they are actually also doing some content creation, because they market the videos by creating tags. They market the videos by creating thumbnail images of the videos, which are forms of creation. And in some cases, users will enter a partner agreement with these websites. So they'll become what they call model hub partners with Pornhub. And they might be and there's requirements to that. So for example, the model hub user has to post a certain number of videos with a certain length of time each. And once they do that on a certain regular basis, Pornhub actually takes up the mantle of marketing these videos further, which means using their algorithms and their other commercial tools to put those videos up front in user searches. And that brings in revenue, not only to Pornhub, but to the model hub partner. So they are literally having business associations with, in a couple of our cases, with traffickers who have drugged or coerced not just women, but girls into acts, filmed them, and uploaded them. And then they have the gall when we take them to court to say, oh, we're shielded by Section 230. This is a third party who created this content. So our cases have challenged that and said, first, no, it's not just a third party. You've actively participated in creating content for these videos, as well as being in a business venture with these parties. And this is not the intent of 230 in the first place. 230 was never meant to shield websites from these egregious acts. It was merely to shield them from being liable for everything that somebody posted that was inappropriate, that they couldn't necessarily always moderate. Does that help? I know it's complicated.
Yeah, no, it really does. I think it's really important that people really understand what the content is and how harmful it is, so that we can mobilize this grassroots response. Because to me, this is just, I don't understand why every legislator, Senate and House member hasn't signed on. This hasn't already gone through and passed. So if maybe you can give us, as hard as it is to hear, people don't want to hear this because it's troubling. It's very troubling. But maybe if you can give us some more examples as best you can of just the nature of it, how horrific it is, who it's harming. And then also if you can get into why has this bill not already moved through? I mean, it just seems what are the obstacles there? Is it the tech companies that are fighting it? Is it, why are lawmakers not endorsing it and co-sponsoring it? And I know that's a lot right there. So either one of you can jump in.
Well, I mean, as far as I could talk about the content, and I think Eleanor has good information on Earn It and the resistance to Earn It. The content on sites like Pornhub's like really the dominates the market in terms of online pornography, along with a couple of other websites. 90% of the content is said to involve violence. So we're talking about things, we're not talking about, something that you might have seen on Cinemax in the 1970s. We're talking about crime scenes. We're talking about deeply violent acts targeted against women and children. Women, and I say women loosely because I really should say females, because in many of the videos we can't tell their age. In many instances, Nick Kristof wrote about this in his New York Times article, The Children of Pornhub. In many instances, the females in the video are barely conscious. In other instances, they're being, crimes of violence are being committed against them. And this is the majority of the content that's out there. And it also includes, other extreme, the extreme sexual acts. And so it's well beyond what we have ever encountered or imagined in terms of the pornographic content maybe that we understood when we were much younger, from Playboy magazine or something like that. This is really extreme and really graphic, and getting onto the websites isn't that hard. Children at very young ages get onto the websites. Something like 84% of access to websites is through smartphones, and more than half of American kids have smartphones by the time they're 11. It's just not that difficult to access. So they're being exposed to harmful content. This in turn grooms them or teaches them an idea of what sex is, because clearly there is no intimacy or care involved in any of these videos. And that in turn leads to harmful consequences, not only in their own development, but in their interrelations with one another as they develop. And then I'll let Eleanor maybe speak to some of the resistance around the Earn It Act.
I want to add one chilling factor, and that is the child sexual abuse material. And we're talking about the rape of infants on changing tables. We're talking about shockingly violent material. The FBI and major police forces are so overwhelmed by this material. They are only trying to interrupt live perpetrators of an abuse of small children and infants. They're not able to cope with children over, around 10 years old because there's so much of this material. We have to curb it. Can government curb this material? Can families? Of course, we can work hard to block access to hardcore pornography to our kids, but the digital companies have to step up. It's really a matter of social responsibility, corporate responsibility, and our common good as a society, because the harms are deep and long-term, both for the victims of the child sexual abuse material. But think of this. This material is often used to groom children into submission. So the material is being used to create more victims, and it becomes this very vicious cycle. We have no choice but to expect more from companies making billions of dollars, right? I'm certainly pro-profit and the pro-profit motive, but I'm also pro-corporate responsibility and the responsibility that corporate citizens have to our common good. And that we're not seeing that. Can Google or Twitter say, we want the right to circulate child sexual abuse material? No, of course they can't. So because they can't say that, they're bringing up red herrings or straw men or whatever we want to call them. They're fake arguments. They're saying that this bill would interrupt privacy, harm efforts to encrypt and protect privacy. Not true. It's not true. Literally just fabricating objections in order to distract members of Congress who, look, campaign contributions come in big numbers from these companies. And so we're up against really
very powerful lobby, and it's shocking. It's the red herrings they use. I remember when we worked a little bit with you guys on the SESTA and the FOSTA, and we were sort of sending letters of support around to congressional leaders, and one of the responses we got was the objections from the tech lobby. So somebody who represents all the big ones, Facebook, Google, you name it, all the big tech companies, they go through the same lobbyists, and the lobbyist had sent the congressional staff his own observations on the bill, saying, and it sounded like somebody, it sounded like a Republican. All the objections were free market, privacy, and it was. It didn't matter to these companies that their representatives really, have nothing to do with their own values even, but they were just simply misrepresenting the laws and proposing red herrings in order to stop a bill essentially that would require them to put a little bit more resources into protecting children from being trafficked.
So you opened, Eleanor, by saying that it has made its way through the Judiciary Committee, and what do you see as the next steps, or what can people do to try to move this?
We need more co-sponsors. I think we're at around 22 senators are co-sponsoring it. Bipartisan bill, Democrats and Republicans. But we need more in order to get Senate leadership to bring the bill to the floor for a vote. And frankly, who can vote against greater responsibility to detect and delete child sexual abuse material, right? It's a fundamental. So there are a lot of sort of blocking games by the other side, as Stefano mentioned, but we can get it to the Senate floor. We've got this momentum coming out of committee from earlier this month, and pressing on senators to co-sponsor, not just support, co-sponsor it, put your name on that bill. And then we'll hopefully use that momentum from the Senate side to press on the House side. Again, the lobbyists have gotten to the members a lot faster than us, but we are real people, right? We have hundreds of organizations, small state level and regional organizations that are really just saying, hell no, this can't go on anymore. It's out of control.
Well, we saw the same pushback from tech on SESTA and FOSTA, and we were successful there in pushing those through. And thank you to Ann Wagner and everyone else who who worked to do that. Could you go over SESTA and FOSTA? Because I look at that as sort of the first generation of sort of restrictions or on the tech companies, or kind of give everybody a background on what that did and how Earn It is sort of the next generation.
So I'll lead and then turn the legal aspect of it over to Pansy. But what SESTA FOSTA, a complicated name because it had a different bill in the Senate side and a different bill in the House side. But what it did was clarify congressional intent that digital companies should not allow sex trafficking on the websites, right? Clarification. It really is a high bar. If you're a victim of sex trafficking and you were advertised on Backpage.com, you have to prove that the digital platform knowingly allowed that sex trafficking to occur. That's a high bar in our legal system. So the cases are coming. They're coming slowly. They will come. But again, the internet didn't crash because SESTA FOSTA passed. The tech lobbyists were claiming the internet would the sky would fall if that bill passed, and it's not true. But we do see some more vigilance and moderation in terms of techs trying to detect sex trafficking. CCM is a relation. It's like a 2.0. Some people call it FOSTA SESTA 2.0, but I think it's really the same thing. It's just another congressional clarification that egregious criminality has no right to thrive in the digital world. It's common sense.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, and FOSTA was really helpful in our case against MindGeek. That so we filed a case against MindGeek because we had a couple of underage victims of assault and trafficking, and their assaults were recorded and uploaded to Pornhub. MindGeek is the parent company of Pornhub, just to clarify. And so we sued Pornhub basically and said, look, you're partnering with traffickers and you're doing absolutely nothing to moderate this content. I mean, these were clearly girls. These were clearly victims of abuse. And FOSTA was what allowed us to make the claim that they were benefiting from trafficking, and as benefactors of trafficking, they were participating in a trafficking venture. And so we were able to overcome their motion to dismiss our case. The court said, no, clearly there's a problem here. And they're participating and perpetuating that problem. And that's, it's really important and valuable to get justice for these victims. One of the things that when I started doing this work, I read in a case was that many victims of image-based abuse never experience post-traumatic stress because they never get past the trauma. They never get to the healing part. Every single time that video is shared, they're re-traumatized. Mm-hmm. It's always constantly out there. They're constantly in the moment of being abused. So it's a very unique, very extreme and dramatic form of assault and trauma that's repetitive. And so it was really, really important to hold companies who are colluding in this accountable. And that's what FOSTA allows us to do. It allows us to say to these companies, you have billions of dollars of revenue. You have the capacity to moderate these videos properly, and you choose not to because you're benefiting from it, and you don't get to benefit from it. That's against the law. Mm-hmm. So it very much empowers victims of these incidents to do so. To do something about it.
It's somehow insisting on that these tech companies basically police themselves, because it's impossible for the government to police them, and that's the big issue here. The internet, the online space is so complex for especially somebody from the outside to monitor. You have these websites or tech companies are able to access all the information instantly, without regards for privacy at all. The government instead has to be concerned about privacy and a whole bunch of other issues, which makes it impossible for the government to effectively police sexual abuse of children, of traffickers on these platforms. So these platforms have, as a society, we have to insist that these platforms police themselves because there's no other way. They have the algorithms, they have the know-how and the resources to do it. In fact, it wouldn't be that costly for them. And yet they want out of that responsibility, which is absolutely incomprehensible. That not more pressure hasn't been brought to bear on these tech companies yet. I wanted to ask you guys who work in this fraught area about the challenge that it is to, for example, address the issues like trafficking, sexual violence, child pornography, and sexual abuse material. Given how much our society is desensitized to this, in particular on the issue of pornography, for example. Now we're just having to change one of the things the Earn It Act does is it changes the way we talk about child pornography. So for over 30 years, we've had federal laws to address child pornography, to tackle it. We enacted strict liability standards that are unprecedented as for any other issues, because of course the only way to address the issue of child pornography is to have strict liability standards, that the mere possession of it is criminal. And but one of the things the Earn It Act does is it changes every mention of child pornography in federal law to this new term, child sexual abuse material, or child exploitation material. And one of the reasons, one of the big reasons given for doing this, of course, is that pornography has become so endemic to our society and it's become so legitimized. It's just completely everywhere, to the point that we know, for example, that children between the ages of 19 and 16, about half of all children between the age of 9 and 16 are regularly exposed to pornography, whether it's soft porn or hard porn. But that means, and these are the ones who are regularly watching this stuff. These are kids, small children who are regularly watching this very harmful material that is scientifically proven to stunt them psychologically and emotionally. So we live in a culture that is completely awash with this smut, and it must be very hard to not always want to just rip out your hair, especially with things like, okay, so now we're going to just to hear, for example, that at the federal level, I don't have any more hair to rip out, but I would if I could. Just to hear that at the federal level, we're not even prosecuting the regular instances of child pornography or looking to address them, because we only have to go after those active perpetrators, the ones who are actively making. And so it kind of defeats the purpose of the strict liability standard if the only way if we can't even go after people, the mere possession of child pornography, right? Anyway, and so it must be also very challenging, though, for you guys when you are making the case in court, when you're making the case to legislatures, as advocates who know this, who know how harmful pornography is, who know how harmful pornography is linked to sexual violence. It's linked to even to child pornography. There's a reason why on Pornhub you can't tell the age of the women or girls involved, right? It's because one thing leads to the other, and it's the same people who end up going to Pornhub for legitimate porn are the same people who end up many times going down the other lane and becoming involved in child pornography. And so what I want to know from you guys, the challenge that it is to not just at a political level, but also morally for yourselves, if you know what I mean, to actually have to promote things like, we want to go on Pornhub, and we only want to challenge this one aspect of Pornhub's business. only the one that involves trafficking. We only want to address one aspect of Pornhub's business, the one that involves minors. So if you could just say something to that. Sorry for the long-winded question.
No, this topic is mind-numbing in its despicable nature. I'm going to give you one very specific example. And this is what inspires us. This is why we work at NCOSE, Pansy and I, and many others. Also to mention, many of us have children. But emergency rooms are reporting a dramatic increase in child-on-child sexual assault. In Kansas City, the Children's Mercy Center, a hospital, started documenting almost half of the perpetrators of sexual violence against girls younger than 10 were between the ages of 11 and 15, mainly boys between 11 and 15. And they believe that it's because of exposure to pornography. So the teenagers are acting out the violent pornography they consume with young girls. Almost half of the perpetrators were between 11 and 15. This is only 3 years ago. Now, what can we do about that as a society? I think, and NCOSE believes, and this is what we're working to do, we need to make our tools. Pansy mentioned earlier, most access to pornography that kids is through cell phones. Half of all kids in America have them by 11. Let's make it harder to access hardcore pornography on cell phones. The filters are embedded in your phone already. When you set up your account, when you activate your phone, how easy is it to make Apple Pay? You're given choices. Apple knows where you're activating the phone. NCOSE supports legislation that is now pending in Alabama, South Carolina, Idaho, and Tennessee, and it was passed in Utah exactly a year ago. And that would insist that manufacturers of cell phones have to activate the filters on. When you activate your phone, default to safety, default to the filter on. It's an easy fix for making it a bit harder for kids to stumble on this stuff. And again, tech lobbyists are fighting it. We modeled this law and worked in Utah closely with legislators there. It was approved, and importantly, it's constitutional. And I'll give it over to Pansy to explain why it's called the Device Filter Act, why it's constitutional. And here's something very few Americans especially know. The Supreme Court has said that governments have a right to protect kids, and they recommend in 2004, Ashcroft versus ACLU, the Supreme Court recommends filters at the device level. Pansy, take it over.
Yeah, so I'm going to address these points about the device filter bill, but I'd actually like to circle back to your question, Stefano, about sort of the moral parsing out we sometimes have to do when we have to manage these issues. But regarding the device filter bill in the Ashcroft versus ACLU case, basically at that point, internet service providers were told by the law that was created at that point, Attorney General Ashcroft at that time is the named party in this case, that said, the state has, and this has been repeated time and time again in pornography cases going way back into the 70s when we were still just talking about pornography being in dirty bookshops. The state has a compelling interest, which is the highest interest possible, to protect children from the harmful content of pornography. Now, the irony is that pornography is also considered First Amendment speech. The court makes a distinction between pornography and obscenity. Obscenity is defined by this sort of vague Miller test, which looks to community standards and prurient interests, and it's a little bit ambiguous to explain. It's one of those, I can't remember which justice says it, but you know it when you see it. So in other words, back in the day when these standards were created, you had like Playboy centerfolds, which I think at that point, many would categorize as pornographic. And then you had the raunchier stuff that you would find in these bookstores that were zoned in the outer parts of town. Basically, the raunchy bookstore stuff is the stuff that you're seeing online all the time right now. Arguably, it's obscenity, and arguably the DOJ should be going after these websites because obscenity is not protected by the First Amendment. But because, as you were saying, pornography has become so normalized, those distinctions are not being made. The DOJ isn't really going after these websites. This stuff is pervasive. And based on this case where we tried to limit pornography at that ISP level and couldn't because it was too broad, and it would interfere with adults being able to access their First Amendment speech, which in this case was pornographic material, the court said, well, look, go ahead and limit it at the individual level, at the device level. And then any adult who wants to access it can access it, but we still meet that compelling need to protect children from this harmful content. And that's why it's perfectly constitutional. We're not talking about a cable company saying, or the state telling a cable company, you cannot show these channels at all. We're talking about built-in parental control filters, which we all already have on our phones, that are very, very hard to dig out, being made very easy to dig out and being enabled on. So once you turn on your phone, it's already there. And then you as an adult can set it up with a passcode to turn it off if you as an adult want to access this First Amendment content. But the child can't easily do so. It's not foolproof because obviously there's going to be some kids who figure out workarounds, but it makes a big difference when you know how many of them have phones and how many of them are accessing this content through their phones. So it's another tool to help parents. And then circling back to your sort of, the question of how we morally live with this. Me personally, I think all pornography is obscenity. I don't think pornography is speech at all. I would love to see pornography banned. That would be the ideal thing to do. When I hear of countries like China banning it, and I think, okay, well, they can even see how harmful it is in China, and we can't even do that. That concerns me deeply because I think that a reflection on the quality of how we govern and the quality of our society is how well we protect our children. There's really nothing beneficial to come from pornography. And it really seems to me personally as an attorney, an error in case law where judges have said that some of this content is speech. I don't believe pornography is speech on a personal level, but I can't relitigate those cases in front of the Supreme Court. I don't have that option. And if I do anything, contrary to the Constitution, I'm not meeting my oath as an attorney. So we try to take an approach, the sort of death by 1,000 cuts approach, sort of the way that tobacco companies were targeted. We couldn't outlaw tobacco at the time. I think some places are getting there now, but we certainly don't outlaw it completely. But we make it so onerous and so difficult. And we create a social sense of its harms that's so great that we end up policing each other about it. Like it's much more rare now to know somebody who smokes. When my mother picks it up again after taking a break for a while, I get on her case about it. I typically don't get on my mother's case about anything because she's my mother, but smoking is one area where we do that. So the idea is to create standards and liability and limitations that are so challenging and onerous that eventually as a society, we recognize this is deeply, deeply harmful. And we start to sort of change things on a cultural level. This is a slow going battle. This takes many, many years. Tobacco cases were starting as early as the 70s, and we were still smoking on planes in the 90s. So it takes a long time to get these messages across and to help a society grow and understand the harms of something. But this is what we're limited by. Tobacco was part of that free market where people have a choice of using it or not. And this is where we're at when we consider pornography, speech. This is a First Amendment protected right. So because of the way the courts have categorized it, we have to tread carefully in limiting it so as to not trample any of our other First Amendment rights, like, for example, having a controversial opinion like I have about banning pornography. That in turn could be a speech issue. So it's a delicate area that we have to sort of tread in.
Thank you. I'd like to, let's see, we're down to about 15 minutes. I'd like to move the conversation to the decriminalization of prostitution, if we can. I know there's a debate within the US, a global debate. We here at the UN are monitoring the issue pretty closely. It's super disappointing for us to see UN agencies, some taking a pro-decrim position, others like UN Women, who are all about expanding the rights of women and increasing their empowerment. It seems to be utterly ridiculous to see them take a neutral position on decriminalizing prostitution when it's so very, very harmful to women. And I don't know any woman who would choose, any girl who grows up saying, I want to go into that as a profession. So would you share with us what NCOSE's position is on it, and maybe even comment on some of maybe the UN positions, as well as what have we seen from the Biden administration early on?
So complex questions, and I always defer to Stefano on the UN matters. But I will say, also want to mention wonderful comments, Douglas and Marianne and Patrice and Etienne. I'm really learning from your chat comments, so I hope we can screenshot those and review them later. But there is a fierce battle waging as we speak. Burlington, Vermont has a town hall election day, a city election on March 1st. On the ballot is the question to fully decriminalize the sex trade in Burlington. The argument put forward, and I would argue that it's an industry argument, that you can make prostitution safer by legalizing it, by letting it happen. That's just not true. Prostitution is inherently violent and harmful. You can't make it safer. In countries like the Netherlands or Germany, where brothels where there's legal prostitution, even so, in legal brothels, they have emergency buttons. So people in prostitution can press when they're in danger. There are no pillows allowed because someone might be smothered. This is not really sexual reality. It's power, it's dominance, it's often acting out pornography. I've interviewed hundreds of people from prostitution, and increasingly they say, and sex trafficking victims say, people buy them in order to act out pornographic scenes. So there's that connection between pornography, prostitution, and, as you pointed out, Lisa, people with any other options are not going to have sex with strangers over and over and over, which is serial rape, in one given day. So that's the fuel for sex trafficking. You have to lure vulnerable people. You have to use drugs to exploit people into prostitution. You have to lure minors in, get them partying, and then sell them for sex. Sex trafficking is inherently related to prostitution. You can't have one without the other. So for Burlington, Vermont, to claim that it's going to make sex work safer is turning, it's upside down world. That's just not possible. But we also have a ballot initiative in Oregon, probably coming up in November for the whole state of Oregon. A admitted and proud sex buyer who's a multimillionaire is paying for this ballot initiative that will fully in fact, legalize. In Oregon, it's a question of legalizing prostitution in the state of Oregon. They have no legitimate arguments about how this can be better or safer. When you talk about the sex work community, it generally includes pimps. It includes brothel owners, includes those who are profiting from the sale of other human beings. So that term, which was invented by pimps to normalize prostitution, is never used by NCOSE. We don't believe in that term. That term is misleading. And these states like Burlington and Oregon are going to rue the day that they unleashed a very violent criminal enterprise on their people, on their citizens.
Andy?
Absolutely.
Pansy, did you want to add anything or?
No, I just wanted to confirm everything that Eleanor said. I think that the legalization or full decriminalization movement is deeply, deeply harmful. We focus on demand. We support exit services for prostituted people and offering them alternatives to incarceration. But we believe in increasing penalties and increasing the targeting of sex buyers and the market that perpetuates sex trafficking and prostitution, which are inextricably intertwined. You cannot distinguish a trafficking victim from somebody who claims they choose to be in that life. And again, as you noted, with real options, very rarely would anybody choose that. In countries where there's full legalization, like Germany, which was mentioned earlier, it's still those who are most vulnerable and most marginalized who are forced into that life. They have mega brothels that are something like 80% immigrant women who can't even speak the language, who don't have access to their own papers. So they don't have the option of looking for better work or another opportunity. It's truly exploitation. In countries like Sweden, where they developed the Nordic model, which basically says we're only going after sex buyers, and this is the crime. You don't get to buy people's bodies. You don't get to buy people for sex. We've seen the opposite. We've seen a reduction in trafficking. We've seen a reduction in harm to those who are still in prostitution. And it's a better model. So I saw a question about the Nordic model in the chat. So I just wanted to quickly address that yes, it's a better model to target demand and not target sales. And this growing trend to call it work is really, it's neither sex nor work. And to be very clear, consent cannot be bought. It's paid rape. It's very, very harmful to women. And it is very much tied with this idea of where pornography is normalized, where the body is a type of transaction, where sex is a type of transaction. It's very harmful. And it leads to other great harms in society.
Could you just talk a little bit about who is behind the promotion of prostitution to make it legal? Right now, especially internationally, I know that there's a lot of pressure being brought to bear on UN agencies to sort of treat prostitution as something legitimate. And there are dozens, if not hundreds, of UN policy documents reports produced by UN agencies that promote the legalization of prostitution. This is going back into the 1990s with UNAIDS already. They've been promoting, the legalization of prostitution as a way to address the HIV/AIDS virus. So, who's behind this, and because that has to be part of the calculus of how to fight this, right? Who is behind promoting all this?
One thing we're seeing in Burlington is there's a relationship between the marijuana legalization lobby and the prostitution legitimization lobby. Wow. There's an organization called decriminalizesex.org, and it's a nationwide organization based in Texas, and they are active around the country, especially right now in Burlington and in Oregon. The Open Society Foundation has been a major funder of organizations that promote prostitution. I call them the pro-pros, the pro-prostitution forces. Open Society Foundation is, of course, George Soros's foundation. And I don't know his motives. I have no idea what's motivating something that is deeply harmful. But they are spending a lot of money on fake research, and they have lobbyists, 3 lobbyists in the state of Vermont. The NCOSE can't go toe-to-toe with that, but we can help our local stakeholders to fight back with facts and figures, because empirical reality and truth is on our side. And that, I think, going back to the moral question, what I find so disturbing is that our nation is tempted to make policy decisions based on falsehood, right? And that's terrible. That's ruinous.
We were, you're absolutely right. And we were certainly disappointed to see in the early months of the Biden administration at the UN, them take a silent approach to calls to decriminalize prostitution in an HIV/AIDS resolution. We know that prior to that, in previous administrations, that would not have happened, that they would have objected to that. And then some months later, the TIP report, I believe, had sex work, a reference to sex work, which probably was for the very first time. I know you were in the TIP office, Eleanor. Was that the first time it had ever referred to sex work?
Absolutely, because it doesn't exist in international convention or law. There is no such thing as sex work. I mean, not only as Pansy mentioned, it really doesn't exist because prostitution is a paid rape, but there's no term sex work. You can only talk about prostitution or sex trafficking. Those are the phenomena that are captured in international conventions, international law, federal statute, state statute. They're inventing something new in part to create this mythology around its beneficial qualities. The Biden administration, I think Secretary Blinken wandered into it with blind, he just didn't know. I think it was just a reflection of ignorance on his part, but someone fed him those lines. We used to clear every talking point that the Secretary of State used is cleared by the Trafficking in Persons Office. So we see it as maybe an effort to kind of sneak in those rhetorical lines, frankly. But organizations from every state in the nation wrote to the Secretary of State and alerted Congress that this cannot be normalized. Prostitution should never be normalized. It is intrinsically linked to sex trafficking, and that harms our most vulnerable citizens. And so we pushed back. The letter didn't get an answer, and thank you for signing, CFAM. Didn't get an answer, but we'll go in early. We'll blow the whistles early and get our pitchforks out at the Department of State a little earlier this time, like starting next month. So thanks for that reminder, Lisa.
Sure thing. Stefano, do we have any questions in the chat box that we need to call on, or when we do have
there's a lot of great comments and questions in the chat box. I do not know that we can get to all of them, but I do wanted to make just a suggestion. You know, earlier you spoke of how China, Pansy, you were mentioning how China is banning pornography and enacting measures to restrict its use, and you know, China is also promoting the use of pornography amongst us. You know that TikTok, for example, the app, it was revealed, there was some reporting about it. I can't remember in what major newspaper recently, documenting how or showing how TikTok promotes the use of pornography amongst our youth. And they do it in a very smart, like all social media companies do, in a very smart way. And it's you know, one video leads to another, and they're trying to get more of our young people to use pornography. And yet domestically within their own countries, they're trying to stop people from accessing pornography. But that just tells you something about how destructive pornography actually is.
Absolutely. Yeah, they're more than happy to protect their own people, and they're more than happy to cause harm cause harm to others, you know, to their advantage.
Well, I think then this is a good time to close. I want to thank our guests, Eleanor and Pansy. Thank you so much. I also want to tell our participants to please go to the NCOSE website. There is a wealth of information on it. Learn about the Earn It, send it to your family and friends. We really do need a grassroots movement here to push that through. So ladies, thank you so much for all the good work that you do. It's truly amazing. And I thank you for being part of our webinar today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.